Good evening, everybody. We are in Windsor, Ontario, broadcasting our second edition of TVO Today Live from Art Windsor, Essex, a beautiful art gallery right across the river from Detroit, Michigan. It's also mere blocks away from the Ambassador Bridge, which was the site of a week-long truckers' convoy protest earlier this year. It brought trade and traffic between our two nations to a complete standstill. Tonight, we're going to examine that protest, the discontent which led to it, and ask a larger question. Are our politics getting too toxic? That's TVO Today Live in front of a studio audience and generously supported by the Wilson Foundation. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming here this evening. Can we welcome His Worship the Mayor of Windsor, Drew Dilkins. First of all, congratulations on your personal re-election.
Thank you.
More than half the votes, so that's a pretty good mandate. I want to take you back to February. Trucker convoy blocking all movement on the Ambassador Bridge, linking this city to the United States. Let's start there. How did that protest affect your city?
Oh my gosh. Anyone who lives in and around the city of Windsor understands that that is the busiest border crossing between our two nations. A full third of all international trade crosses at the Ambassador Bridge, and thousands of people rely on smooth and efficient border crossings to get to work. To keep hospitals open in Detroit, to engineers going to work in Detroit for the big three. And so when something like that happens where the border crossing is closed to international trade, we're talking about $300 million each and every day. And it's not just something felt in my city's economy, it's our regional economy, it's our provincial economy, and frankly, it's national.
What worried you most about that convoy?
Well, the tenor certainly on the street was very, very troubling, but I also knew that we had gone through a very significant period of disruption with respect to the pandemic and the starts and the stops and the closures and the openings. And each and every day that the calendar turned, where that bridge was closed, I knew that there were lots of people in my community, thousands and thousands of people in my community whose job was at risk. Plants that would just shut down if they could not ship their goods through a just-in-time delivery process like the automotive industry works in. And so there were lots of concerns going on from the tenor and the temperature out on the street, but also the economic security in our community as well.
How much support for that convoy do you think existed in this city at the time?
Well, I think there was a lot more dissent, and we certainly heard from people in the community who were saying, just move these people out. How are these folks allowed to disrupt our national economy? A couple hundred folks, how is that allowed to happen? And so there is no doubt that there was support locally. There were some people who felt aggrieved by the rules, and some people who also just were anti-government, who joined the protest and weren't quite sure why they were there, except they didn't like government. And we saw that play out as well on the streets. But by and large, the vast majority of people in our community are sensible. They understand that that is not the appropriate way to protest and not the appropriate venue to protest.
At the risk of asking a bit of a chippy question here, did you see it as somehow American-style protest tactics imported into Canada?
Well, I think I would probably look up the road and look to Ottawa first, because we saw what was happening on the streets of Ottawa. It started there with the bouncy castles and the jacuzzis that were being brought in on the streets of Ottawa, and then certainly as we looked down the 401 to the city of Windsor, I knew that if folks were coming here, this would have a major impact on our economy. And I also know from the past that it's very difficult to move people out very quickly. And so we saw the worst case scenario play out on the streets in terms of the blockade happening and really lasting a week and having a material impact on our national, our provincial, and certainly our regional economies.
And just finally, do you see our politics getting increasingly toxic? And if you do, what do you attribute it to?
Well, I absolutely I do. And I think part of it is the tenor from leadership. And so I think, whether you're a mayor, whether you're a premier, a prime minister, a president, a state senator, anyone in a leadership role certainly has a role to play to pattern the behavior and mimic the behavior that they want to see play out in society. And so we have that responsibility, and I take that responsibility very seriously. I also think that, through the internet, people are able to find sources of information that they think they align with or that interests them more. And we've seen, I would say, the danger of what's happening with mainstream media, where you see mainstream media melting down very, very quickly. even locally, folks here are doing their best to operate a paper and a radio station and TV station, but the resources that were there 4 years ago and 8 years ago aren't there today. And so what that means, you don't have the same guardrails, the same checks and balances in place with mainstream media that you used to have to help keep people accountable who are running for public office, who are putting out information that is either misinformation or disinformation.
I'm going to sneak one more question in. Have you ever felt insecure in this job?
Oh, absolutely.
How does it manifest itself?
Well, it manifests itself. You know, I have a family as well. I have 2 kids and a wife, and we all live under the same roof. And so when someone goes to a polling station like they did this week on election day and said that if Drew Dilkins is reelected, they're going to come and assassinate me, that is concerning.
That happened.
That happened. And so my wife walks out on Tuesday morning and said, "Why are the police here?" And so now I'm scratching the surface, figuring out why the police are at my house, and that's what I came to find out. And so that behavior has certainly happened more in the last 4 years than I've seen any other time in my city's history. And so that should be concerning for all of us, whether you are a local official, provincial, national, it doesn't matter. We're here to do what's right. We're here to have a conversation with the public. We may not always agree with each other's opinion, but I think we have a responsibility to have a civil discussion to see if there's a way to find a pathway to move forward together, because ultimately everyone running for public office, everyone serving, wants to do right by the community that elected them.
We're going to try to do that right now. Your Worship, thank you for getting us started here today. If you wouldn't mind, take your seat back in the audience and enjoy the rest of the program.
Thanks, Steve.
Drew Dilkins, everybody. Thank you. Well, I want to introduce to everybody here 5 guests who have really come quite a great distance to be with us here at this beautiful art gallery today. And because we're such classy people, we're going to introduce our 2 American friends first and then our 3 Canadian friends after that. Starting with the former ambassador from the United States to Canada, all the way from Chicago, Illinois, Bruce Heyman, right over here. There we go. Ambassador, right here, thank you. Just from the other side of the river, the Michigan State Senator for District 1, Stephanie Chang, is here. Stephanie. All the way from the riding of Calgary Nose Hill in Calgary, Alberta, Michelle Rempel Garner, right over here. And the former mayor of the city that Michelle represents, here's Naheed Nenshi. And finally, the author of a new book that's getting a lot of attention. It's called The Right Path: How Conservatives Can Unite, Inspire, and Take Canada Forward. Welcome from the provincial capital, Tasha Kiranen, right here. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. I know you've all come great distances to be with us today, and we're truly grateful for that. Although, Stephanie, you just came from across the river. Not a great distance, but pretty much everybody else did. Last February, I want to go back to that because we saw a level of protest in this country that we are not accustomed to seeing. It did not exactly rise to the level of January the 6th in the United States, but by Canadian standards, it was pretty intense stuff. And I guess I want to ask, and Ambassador, you can start us off here, has the toxicity that we have seen in American politics, in your view, come across the border to us now?
So first of all, let me just say hello to everyone and thank you for hosting me here today. It's really a pleasure to be back in Canada. I think the toxicity has been in politics long before today. It's been here for a very long time. The issue is like an iceberg that you may see only a bit sticking out, and you think it isn't that large. A lot of stuff has been happening below the surface. I think today, with social media and the way people are communicating, the appearance is much larger because I think a lot of it has risen above the waterline. But it's always been there. It was here when I was the ambassador. It's been here probably well before I ever arrived here. It will be here going forward. The question is how we deal with this toxic environment, how we try to find pathways of reaching agreement across different perspectives and different views. And right now it's really hard because people are just digging in. And, you know, if you're on this team or this group or this party, I'm against you, and I'm against you so much that it becomes vitriol. and hatred. And we're watching, the mayor talked about the experience he had at the polling. We just saw Nancy Pelosi's husband being attacked. We've seen the insurrection take place on January 6th, a year and a half ago. I think it's here. But watching what happened in Ottawa in the Ambassador Bridge and watching the American right-wing media using it as a tool to raise money, to propel an ideology, I think it is particularly dangerous. And there are no borders. While I crossed the border today, there are no borders for the internet. There are no borders for this media. And so I think it's particularly a dangerous time, not only cross-border, but globally.
Senator Chang, how do you see it?
So, I just remember calling Brian Massey as I was watching things unfold, and
One
I
of
said,
the MPs here.
Yeah, and I said, this is like the most un-Canadian thing I've ever seen. Just because, as a Michigander, as an American, I think we have this view of Canadians as very polite, and we don't necessarily see the same types of extremism. At least from our side, it's just not as visible. So obviously, I'm not Canadian. I don't know sort of what is or isn't true. But there's definitely a perception of Canadians as not being as extremist or not being as divided as America is. And so I don't necessarily know the answer to your question, but certainly from an American perspective, I think we were pretty shocked by watching all of it, and especially the fact that it went on for so long, both here in Windsor and in Ottawa. And, as someone who was both at our state capitol when we had sort of a precursor to the insurrection, back in the second month of COVID in Michigan, we actually had armed protesters in our state capitol. And some of them we actually learned later were involved in the plot to kidnap and assassinate our Governor Gretchen Whitmer. So I think here in Michigan, across the river, we're very much unfortunately aware of, and to some degree, I think that a lot of this extremist rhetoric and action has become normalized to some extent, which is very, very frightening.
Michelle Rempel Garner, do you think we are living in increasingly toxic times? And if so, where do you put the blame?
I think in the last 10 years, we have certainly seen an acceleration towards losing the ability to pause and consider someone else's viewpoint in trying to build, a policy outcome that benefits everybody. And it's to the point where I actually think leaders are disincented from taking a consensus-building approach because, for a lot of the reasons that have been mentioned already, how we communicate now, it's actually a lot easier just to dunk on your opponent than to try to actually say, okay, maybe somebody's got a point here. I think it's really important to note, though, that this isn't something that is new. I mean, we have to talk about, how minority, racialized communities have always had a hard time getting their voices heard and being othered. And I think that over the last decade, we're seeing just a dehumanization across the board of issues which we really should be able to find a common ground on, like, okay, how can we provide energy security and deal with climate change? How can we, address some of the, like vaccine hesitancy? The Royal Society put out a report in the spring of last year that had it was just this incredible report that talked about why Canadians were vaccine hesitant in Canada and how the government could work to overcome this. And it became this fissure of an issue. And that's what I worry about. I certainly have seen that increase in my time in politics, but I don't think this is without optimism, but it certainly will, in terms of finding a solution to address this, it is going to take an all of society approach to deal with it. We have to prioritize finding a solution because I really think the only people that benefit from this are states and actors that hate democracy, that hate our way of life, and there's a lot at stake. So, I hope we can spend some time today talking about solutions and offer some people some hope.
Indeed. Mayor Nenshi, where are you coming from on this?
Remember, not mayor anymore, just not him now. And by the way, Ambassador, that's an interesting thing. In Canada, we don't get to keep the titles. You get to be ambassador forever. I think three quick things. Number one is, yes, of course, it's gotten much worse. There's no dilly-dallying around that. The lives of politicians, the lives of those in public life have gotten much, much worse, and not just online, in real life as well. When I think of my decade and a bit in politics, the security challenges we had were completely different at the end than they were at the beginning. I think it would be a mistake to say that that's an American thing that's being imported here. It is a worldwide phenomenon. We saw it in Poland a decade ago. We've seen it in Brazil, in Hungary, really around the world, in addition to the United States. And it has also come here. But I'm a little bit more pointed than my colleague Michelle here on the causes of this, which is, I have to say that much of this is by design. It has been designed this way.
By whom?
It has been designed this way because two things have happened, in my opinion, and Tasha's much smarter on this stuff than I am, but in my opinion, two things have happened. Folks on what we might traditionally call the left, and I don't really believe in left-right spectrums. I believe that the hardening of society that we've seen is a strange coalition of people who might be classified as the hard rights, but also people who believe in natural healing and things like that, who found themselves together with these folks in common cause on COVID, for example. But what we've seen is people who are sort of on the quote-unquote left have been looking for an increasingly quote-unquote progressive agenda that threatens some other people's power and privilege. And we've seen people on the right, frankly, realize that there is a group of folks who never really voted before, accessible voters, people who are disillusioned with the system. And I've seen a lot of this in my own political life, is that there's a lot of design around getting those folks to vote. Some people would use the word radicalization. And I often say that in my time in office, I was invited to innumerable conferences on the problem of radicalization of Muslims in Canada. I've never been invited to a conference on the radicalization of white people in Canada. But we're seeing a lot of this, and we're seeing it for political gain. And so I have a premier in Alberta now who actually said the quiet part out loud. She actually said, if I can hold on to these folks and they vote, I don't have to worry about the folks in Calgary and Edmonton. I'll get a majority anyway. Most people don't say the quiet part out loud. But this is designed this way. And it is working. I don't know what Drew's voter turnout was. Maybe he'll yell it out in this last election.
31%.
31%, that's pathetic. Sorry, Drew.
In Ontario.
And amongst the highest in Ontario. 20-something% in Toronto. People are turned off by the system because they see only these loud actors that they disagree with on either side running the system. They're not voting. That is the point. So the point is that someone like Premier Smith can appeal to a group of folks who might only be 10 or 20% of the population, but 80% of them vote. And so that's, I think, what I worry about the most, is this didn't just happen. We didn't just unearth the iceberg. The iceberg was unearthed. These people always felt that way, but they've been increasingly radicalized and increasingly brought into the system.
Tasha, what would you add to that?
Well, to build on that, actually, I think that the data piece is an important one to note, because political campaigns have been increasingly data-driven since the early 2000s. Segmented vote, it's kind of like the long tail of advertising. You want to find your niche voter and you tailor your message to them. What we see with that, though, is that polarity pays, because you find a way to get your group further and further from the others. So you don't have the conversation anymore. You keep them in one space so they will be loyal to you. And when you look at numbers, because I'm a data person, you see, though, that in Canada, it's quite different than the United States. In Canada, 62% of us, according to a study that Environics did, 22 countries were included, 62% of us consider ourselves in the political center. In the United States, it's 38%. And the far extremes in Canada are only 4% left and 4% hard right. But in the US, it's 12 and 17. So you do have definitely a hardening of the vote. I think it is migrating here because, unfortunately, it is effective. To your point, design is maybe not the word I would use. It's more strategy that would be seen by a campaign to say this is the way that we can actually win, take power. The problem with that, though, is that it does then create toxicity, because to maintain that vote, you need to animate it. You need to make it hate something else. It's not enough to be positive. You need an enemy. And if you have an enemy, that means that you cannot agree with anything they say, because if the minute you do, you're out of the group. You're not loyal to your side. So you create a dialogue of the deaf, and that's what you see on social media, where the minute anyone, I've been called a liberal, I'm a conservative. I don't consider myself, I'm called a liberal because the minute I say anything good about anything that Justin Trudeau may have done or Chrystia Freeland's speech the other day, that is just anathema to anyone who is on the right today. So that is the problem we're facing, is an inability to have conversations like this where people weigh one on the one hand, on the other, because it doesn't pay politically. And that is, to me, the greatest concern.
Michelle, let me get your take on this. We have always, on this side of the border, been of the view that we're somehow a kinder, gentler country than the United States, just because we're Canadians, and Canadians are awfully nice people. You've been in public life for a decade. Is that the truth?
I think it's dangerous when any country uses a sense of exceptionalism to ignore problems. And I think that Canada, we have to have an introspective look on that. There's a variety of issues where I think, we think the kids are okay and it's not. I think, though, we have to resist the temptation. My colleague here used the term "these people," right? There are groups of people who do not feel heard. Now, and I want to be very clear, I don't want this to be framed as an apologist perspective for any sort of extreme view. That's not what I'm about to say. But there are a lot of people who, left or right, feel disenfranchised from the political system right now, right? I would be remiss if I didn't say, energy sector workers in Alberta, right? What do their futures look like? First Nations reconciliation, how come we haven't been able to address missing and murdered Indigenous women? And when we just sort of assume that it's social media or just political campaigns, we're actually removing each of our agency and responsibility from this discourse, and we're also dehumanizing the discourse that needs to happen. And I do see that happening in Canada. I'll close with this. I mean, I have a bit of a unique perspective. My husband's American. My stepchildren grew up in a flyover state. And, I think about, yes, I think about my stepdaughter, and I put a little post out today about her. She's in her second year of college. She has had to contract with the U.S. Army. She's very proud of her service, but she's had to contract with the U.S. Army, take a full-time job at minimum wage. We're supporting her, and she'll have debt just to have the hope of going to college, right? She is very passionate about gender equality and human rights, but she's also passionate about the lack of opportunity and fiscal responsibility that is impacting her generation. If she wants to talk about gender equity policy, she's, a far lefty with lefty sauce, right, and is sorted that way. If she wants to talk about the left's inability to really speak to those economic issues, she's a fascist, right? And I think that's far beyond political campaigns. It's far beyond. It's something that I also see in our country, and that is really the issue. We can't just put it onto some political actor or just on social media. Has that exacerbated it? Yes. But this is really a whole of society issue that we just sort of think is okay, or that someone else's job to change, and it's each of our job to change, and I'm really worried about it.
Ambassador Heyman, I don't want to get you in trouble with the Clinton family, but having said that, I think some of the folks that Michelle may be referring to in that answer was the people that Hillary Clinton called this basket of deplorables. How much of that statement exacerbated a lot of the problems we're talking about here?
So I'm going to go back to the mayor's comment when he was up here. And he said the tone is set at the top and works its way down. And I totally agree with that. And I believe people in leadership have a responsibility to set the tone. Whether you're a former person or a current person or running for office, I think it's important to set that tone. You have a number of followers. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, in the States, a number of leaders have used language that is unfortunately exciting their base in ways that are not constructive.
Is the example I just gave one of those?
It was an unfortunate term and one that I would not have used, and I would say that I think that probably cost her in some part in her campaign. That being said, we had a sitting president who used much worse terms about people from his own party, which we've talked about, even people who deviate from his perspective and views, to the point where they even feared the outcome of what would happen. And thus he has a number of disciples following in, people who I know truly, I don't believe in their heart follow him, but are too scared not to. And thus the tone set at the top is really important here in Canada, in the United States, and around the world. And it comes with a lot of responsibility when you have these leadership positions.
Senator Chang, how carefully do you and your colleagues in Michigan speak to be sure that you don't accidentally inspire people to do crazy things?
Honestly, if I can just be totally, I really think that, I'm a Democrat, and my Democratic colleagues and I think are trying to actually bring more people in. That's sort of what Democrats do. We try to bring people in. Whereas I think that a lot of folks on the other side have done quite a lot to try to make it harder for people to vote, make it harder for people to have reproductive freedom, constantly are attacking trans children for just really hateful, reasons, and injecting some of that into conversations that have nothing to do with trans children. So I actually think that we have got a lot of work to sort of undo that damage. I'm a daughter of immigrants who came to America looking for better opportunity. They believed in, America where everyone can have a chance to succeed and thrive. And I think that type of America is really being eroded by a lot of the hateful rhetoric that is all about othering people and all about trying to divide people. So I think that we've got a lot of work to do to try to bring people back in. And to really focus on real issues. So some of us were talking earlier about a lot of this is sort of distracting from pocketbook issues. What are people trying to, just trying to get through the week, trying to pay their bills, trying to make it to the next, thing that they've got going on. And unfortunately, we've still got folks who are debating whether or not the 2020 election was stolen. So going back to what I said earlier, it would be really nice if we can get back to a point where we're just talking about issues and based on a shared set of facts, but we're so far away from that right now.
Well, Naheed Nenshi, let me try this with you. There are a lot of Canadians who think that Ottawa is a swamp, but there's a lot of people from your part of Canada that really think it's a swamp. And I wonder how much of this problem of toxicity in politics today, in your view, is because Ottawa feels very disconnected from very many people's lives, particularly the lives of those who live in Western Canada.
I think there's part of that, certainly. In my time as mayor, I dealt with two prime ministers from two different political parties who could not have been more different. And I probably fought equally with both of them, which is part of the most interesting thing about municipal politics, by the way, and I'll come back to that in a second. But it's interesting that the United Conservative Party leadership race, the agenda was set by Premier Smith, now our Premier, all about Alberta versus Ottawa. But all of the polling that was done shows that federal-provincial relations is number 5, number 8, number 10 on the list of things that Albertans actually care about. Sometimes I say that politicians like to present what I call the Jan Brady view of Alberta. Now, many of you in the room are much too young to get the reference, but you remember Jan Brady was the middle child. She was popular and smart and pretty.
This is the Brady Bunch.
The Brady Bunch.
The old TV show.
But absolutely obsessed with her older sister, Marcia. Marcia. And that's sort of Alberta. We're by far the wealthiest part of the country. We've done extremely well for ourselves. It is by far the best place in the country to live, Calgary being the best place in Alberta to live. Calgary Nose Hill being the second best part of Calgary to live. But the part where I live is, of course, the best. But yet, our political discourse is about this thing that we can't really control. And most Albertans think that we write a check to Quebec every year. And they think if we solve equalization, then we'll pay less in taxes. It's not the truth. We pay the same in taxes as everyone else. It's just the federal government decides where to send those that money. But it's a real distraction, and it's a convenient one. Liberals do it, Conservatives do it, New Democrats do it, but it's a real distraction from getting to the real issues before us. So, you know, when we talk about healthcare, our Premier talks about the COVID response and what a disaster it was and how we should have looked at therapeutics differently, blah, blah, blah. None of that has one single thing to do with the fact that people are waiting 10 or 14 hours in line at the emergency room. But because we don't want to answer that question, we distract it with another question, like the issue of whether we feel represented in Ottawa. By the way, when we had a Conservative government, when Michelle was a minister in that government, we complained just as much, maybe a little bit less, even though that government was a government that matched everyone that we voted for. So it's not really, it's helpful for politicians. I don't think it gets to how people live their lives every day. And I think, I'll just say this briefly, I think that's where municipal government is interesting to me. I noticed the ambassador is wearing purple today. I wear purple every day. I have for 12 years, not because it brings out the color of my eyes, not only because it brings out the color of my eyes, because it's red and blue. Because I try to remind people that we are defined by our humanity, not by our partisanship, not by our tribes. And there's none of that in provincial or federal politics right now. I still think mayors are the future. I still think that municipal government can show the way of how we work across the aisle together. But even there, my optimism is starting to get a little rusty.
Tasha, we have a federal government in place right now that was elected with the smallest percentage of the total vote in Canadian history.
Yes.
How much of that accounts for the fact that there's a great deal of incivility in major parts of this country right now?
Well, I'm not sure if it accounts for the incivility. I think that it's part of the dynamic that we see with different parties, like the Bloc Québécois being sort of having a stranglehold or a parking lot, as they say in Quebec, on the Quebec vote, which carves out a lot of potential vote for both of the other parties, frankly, Conservatives and Liberals. But I would say probably more for the Liberals, traditionally, in Quebec. But what I think is interesting, to pick up something Michelle said earlier too, is that it is a strategic issue, I think, politically, is how this is being manipulated. But you have to have something to manipulate to begin with. And I think that's where we do have to recognize that when you look at the evolution of the workplace, of the dynamics of who is succeeding socially and who is not, who is succeeding economically and who is not. If you go back to a 2008, 2009 recession, there was an entire group of people, entire generation actually, who saw, in some cases, themselves lose their jobs or their parents lose their jobs. There was a serious loss of wealth in the United States more than Canada, but a significant loss of household wealth at that time that in some cases has never been caught up. And then you have the other dynamics of the demise of the manufacturing economy in the heartland of the US. You have automation. You have people who don't have a lot of skills or transferable skills who've been put out of the workforce and have nowhere to go. And that sense of being left behind is very profound, and it animates a lot of the anger we're seeing and a lot of a search for a political champion, for example, whether it is Donald Trump, for example, in the United States, or in Canada, you've got unionized workers. Doug Ford is trying to capitalize on the labor and the sort of the working class. Pierre Poilievre called out to people who've also been left behind, saying no one's listening to you. We want to build more homes, pay less taxes. Very simple slogans. Well, why are things so simple? Because a lot of these folks, believe it or not, can't even read and write. You want an issue? I will put one out that's not talked about a lot. In Canada, 48% of Canadians are functionally illiterate.
How are you defining that?
They cannot read or write at a higher than a grade 6 education. In the United States, it's 56%. If you think the way that jobs are evolving in our economy, how do you participate in those jobs? And these are adults in many cases who've worked sometimes 20 years in a job which didn't use their literacy skills. They may have graduated high school, but they've gotten rusty over time. And so they need to be upskilled. They need to be taught the basics of reading and writing. And you also can't consume information very well, political information, if you don't have those skills. So I think education, we talk about healthcare, we talk education, basic education is something that we have to look at as a lifelong thing for our society to make sure people are able to participate, because if they can participate, they will be less angry.
Well, apropos of Michelle's admonition from a little while ago, we know what the problem is. Let's see what we can do about it. And Ambassador, I'm going to start with you first and just remind you and this audience of some things that have happened relatively recently that are incredibly disquieting. You've mentioned the attack on the Speaker, Nancy Pelosi's husband already, which saw him go to the hospital. We had during the last federal election campaign in this country, somebody toss a fistful of gravel at the Prime Minister of the country as he was on a campaign bus. I recently moderated a mayor's debate in the city of Toronto where somebody rushed the stage and got within about a foot of the current mayor of Toronto, who ended up winning the election. But I don't think anybody knew what his intentions were as he got very close to the space of the mayor. We saw the deputy prime minister of the country, Chrystia Freeland. Somebody went after her and started screaming at her profanities, somebody twice her size. A lot of this stuff is incredibly disquieting. Is there anything we can do to increase the civility, lower the temperature, and have less of this happening?
First of all, I wish I had a magic answer for that. It is incredibly unsettling, and what's even more unsettling is that given what you've just described, a lot of really good people are not entering into the political landscape because of that. And thus we keep sitting around saying, why don't more good people raise their hand and decide to run for office? And when you have this kind of environment that people's families and their communities will tell them, why would you do that to yourself or to us as a family? And it's totally understandable. I think we as a society have to call a stop to it. We have to come together and not let all of us accept that kind of behavior.
How do we do that?
Well, you have to do it vocally. You have to do it with your community. You have to do it in raising your children. You have to do it with your peer group. You know, it starts person by person. And unfortunately, this is going to take a lot of work because this is not in just one community, one city, one party, one place. It's a phenomenon that is spread like a cancer. And we have to work on this together and trying to say, hey, when you're in a conversation and somebody comes up with a statement, either racism or anti-Semitism or hate speech, we have to call it out. We can't just be bystanders. We have to be upstanders. We have to be able to counter this. And it's hard because you put yourself out there in the fray. But I'm not asking you to run for office, but I'm asking you to sit there and be what Thomas Jefferson said, the most important person in our society is the citizen. And you have to be a citizen. And we all own this responsibility. And in fact, maybe you're all ambassadors of good behavior and we're going to go out and promote it. And I don't mean this facetiously. I mean it literally. I mean, because I think we're allowing people to behave in ways without being confronted. Not confronted physically, not confronted with getting arrested or doing anything, but confronted in a dialogue and just saying to your friends, look, that's just not right. You know, we can't accept that around the dinner table in our household as friends. And instead of cutting them off, we need to engage.
We have two people here from Calgary, both of whom have been on the receiving end of more crap on social media, maybe than, or certainly as much as anybody in our country. And I'd really like to hear from the two of you now on what we do to fix that and try and get things more civil. Michelle, you want to start us off?
I don't think, first of all, that the government can regulate good behavior. I think right now a lot of the solutions are being focused towards government intervention, and I don't see that as a thing. There's always going to be some other venue or platform to foment divisiveness. I sort of started my political career just as social media was taking off, right? So I was like, I don't know if you've seen that meme with the dog in the lab. I don't know what I'm doing. That's kind of how I felt. So I have, won, but I've also made mistakes, right? And I think you have to, the last few years, I've really been more self-aware about who am I talking to? Who am I saying, I see you to? Am I saying that just to one group of people? So setting an example in a leadership position, I think this has come up, is very important. I really do think that at the end of the day, it's a combination of setting an example from a leadership perspective in everything that we do and everything that we say. I'm really trying today to be as nonpartisan as possible because of how serious this topic is, and then don't reward leaders that refuse to accept this principle and lead it by example. And it's on both sides of the debate. I mean, like, you cannot nobody can sit here and say that one side is more virtuous than the other. That's the problem too. And, for whatever time, I'm awarded by the public to keep representing them, I think for me, that is the number one imperative for me in my public service right now. Because again, like, just to underscore this, the people that benefit from this are Vladimir Putin, right? Like, this is not a joke. And I think it's that level of gravity in getting to those places that I hope is what resonates with our society going forward.
Naheed, you're the first big city Muslim mayor ever in Canadian history. Have I got that right? So
In the Western world, they say.
So you've seen your share of this. What do we do?
I agree with much of what Michelle said. I think, in fact, I agree with all she said, except I would add a little more to it, which is, it's not just Vladimir Putin who wins. If it was just Vladimir Putin who wins, then people wouldn't be doing it. Because people see political victory for themselves in this kind of work. So if I can underscore what Michelle was saying, maybe add to it a little bit. The first is that people in my former profession need to cut it out. We need to stop taking the bait. We also need to stop baiting the hook. There are politicians in town, so there's a very live debate, as Michelle alludes to, on online regulation right now. And there are politicians in the country who've reached out to Elon Musk asking him to take a stand on this. We know that if Elon Musk takes a stand on this, there will be an avalanche of abuse for people who are in favor of these bills. We did it anyway. We all have to know, and it's hard. Michelle and I have gotten into tiffs in public in the past on things, and it's so easy, if you look at either of our Twitter feeds, for us to take the bait. Both of us have stopped allowing replies, which is smart, but we still take the bait. She does it, I do it all the time. I'd like to think I'm witty about it and fun, but really I'm punching down. And we've got to stop punching down. We've got to, as politicians, get over that. But I think what's even more important than that is to underline what the ambassador has said, which is our responsibility as citizens. We can't blame this all on the politicians. The politicians wouldn't do it if they didn't think citizens enjoyed it. And whether that's in likes and retweets on social media, whether that's in votes at the ballot box. And I think we as citizens need to figure out how we bridge those divides. So if you've ever heard me speak in the last 11 years, you've learned one word that's very common in South Asian languages. It's a Sanskrit word that's seva. Seva means service. It means selfless service. And what I really believe is that as we encourage citizens to work hard on building community in our own ways, true change doesn't come from politicians and ex-politicians sitting on panels like this. It comes from everyday people making change in their community. So for 11 years, I've had a program that I took with me when I left the mayor's office, quite literally, because it's just a giant foam number 3 that lives in my basement now, called 3 Things for Canada, which is a simple program that just encourages every citizen every year to do 3 acts of community service at least. Whether big or small, it doesn't matter. Just acts of service to get yourself out in the neighborhood, knowing your neighbors more, understanding that we are all in the boat together, rowing together. And to me, that really matters. We can say as much as we need to about, oh, we should value people with different opinions, we should make space for folks, and so on. We can say as much as we want to say about we should stand up for what's good and right. All of those things matter. What really, really matters is understanding that we're all in this project of community building together.
Senator Chang, from your side of the Detroit River, what's it going to take to get us to take a few steps back from the edge?
As I was listening to the other panelists, one of the things I was thinking about is our kids. So, I got a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old, and one of the things that we have been debating in America has been, what do we teach in our schools? And one of the things that I think has been missing, and as I think about the rhetoric and about whether or not someone's able to digest a piece that's on the news and figure out if it's true or not, is critical thinking, right? And so, and then I also think about the fact that, my kids are Black and Asian in America, and they're growing up in a state where we currently don't require that, that Asian American history is taught in schools, or that Black history is taught in schools, or that we learn about, each other's communities. And so I actually, in the wake of a lot of this doesn't sound connected to your question, but it's going to come all together. In the wake of all of the anti-Asian hate that's been, going on for long before COVID, but also during COVID, one of the things that has really emerged in America anyway is this idea that we really should be teaching this history in schools. And part of the reason why is not just for, my kids and other Asian American kids to learn this history, but for other kids to learn it too. And this whole idea of our kids need to learn about each other and learn about all of our history, learn about the painful parts of our history, and as well as the triumphs in our history. And based on trying to empathize with what someone's life experience is. And I think that, my kids are my motivators for continuing to do the work that I do. And I would imagine the same is true for many of the people up here. And they deserve a better world. So we've got to do better.
Tasha, just before I give you the last word on this, I want to remind the audience, there's the microphone right there. If you have questions for our invited guests here today, please line up behind the microphone right over here, and we'll take questions right after Tasha wraps us up here. Go ahead.
Okay, so I couldn't agree more, Senator Chang. I have a 13-year-old daughter, and I also feel that the education system is not encouraging the kind of critical thought, and not just critical thought, but I think also openness to dialogue and debate. And in that sense, I think we need more of what I call civic literacy. Kids get taught in school history, but it is not necessarily the nature, the importance of democracy and civics. We take it for granted, right? We take it for granted democracy will just go on ad infinitum, that, oh yes, in the Western world, if we export democracy, everyone will think it's fantastic and get on board. And we've learned that is not the case, that states veer towards autocracy. There's always a danger, even within your own country, that people will go to extremes, manipulate others. So we need to be aware of how that happens. And yes, whether it's malign actors, foreign states that try and do that, we need to be able to understand what is happening. So it starts with young people to be taught this kind of media literacy, civic literacy. We need that kind of education. But we also need to take pride in our country. And this is something that's actually been measured too. I know Jeffrey Simpson wrote a very interesting piece about how we recognize the wrongs we've done, and we have done many historical wrongs, absolutely. But at the same time, we have to emphasize that there's something that binds us together too, common things that we are proud of and that we are defending as a nation, as a group together. So to avoid the divisions, the constant, how are we different from each other? But why did my parents come here? Why did your parents come here? I don't know if any of, if your parents were immigrants. There's a commonality where almost all of us, some point, from somewhere else, because we chose this country. Why? So I think that's something, education to me, again, I go back to that, is something extremely important to find the glue to keep us together in these difficult conversations.
Wonderful. Okay. It's this audience's turn. Sir, you have the first question.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to Windsor. I really enjoyed the conversation and your inputs, but my question is to Ms. Garner. I have tremendous respect for you for your vote on LGBTQ rights, but as a person who fled, I was born in Iran and I fled when I was 17 because they wanted to execute me by stoning, and came to Canada, and you shared your daughter's story about how, she's polarized from both sides. How can someone like me not feel polarized by a party who has a leader who voted against the right to have same-sex marriage in Canada in 2005, and once voted in 2006 to open the debate on it? How can I not feel polarized and be open to the ideas and even considering to vote for that party when that leader was supported by MPs who voted against the ban of conversion therapy this year?
So it's a great question. And first of all, I want to start by saying that the rights of the LGBTQ plus community are human rights. And, I really do think that nations and cultures that protect those rights are protecting their democracy and their freedom by doing that. I would say that one of the proudest moments of my time in office was when the Conservative Party of Canada changed the definition of marriage in our policy declaration. and it was 10 years after marriage was legalized. And so when we voted on this in Vancouver, a lot of the media that I did was like, well, geez, a decade too late, right? But now Canada is one of the only countries in the world where our right of centre party supports marriage equality in our party's policy declaration. So it is about demanding rights and saying that they are red line issues for every political actor, and then also ensuring that there's change within political parties so that those rights aren't eroded. And part of how that happens is getting people to change their views. Mr. Poilievre, I know, made that vote in 2005, but since then has voted, in favor of banning conversion therapy, has been very clear on his position on those rights. And I think, if we just, I would celebrate, I don't want to equivocate this, but I would celebrate, I would do the happiest dance if Justin Trudeau stood up and said, you know what, Alberta's energy sector workers are really important to the Canadian economy, and we need to think about energy security as much as we think about climate change. That would be a big evolution of his thinking, and I would be like, yes, that would be a celebration of victory. So we have to, on one hand, hold politicians like myself to account for votes. One of the votes I regret the most was when I was first elected, I voted in favor of what ended up being the trans rights bill on second reading and then against on third. And then I gave a speech in the House of Commons in the next Parliament and said, no, we have to support this bill. We have to support this bill. We shouldn't absolve people of those votes, but at the same time, we also have to celebrate when there has been forward progress. Otherwise, we disincent people from changing their minds because we say that there's no quitter, right? At the end of the day, though, it's not for me to say whether or not you should or shouldn't trust. That's up to you as a voter, and it's up to us to give you that reason, right? But what I can say is one of the things we can celebrate in this country is that for the most part, we are on a positive track to enshrining human rights across the political spectrum. Do we have to be on guard to ensure that that's not eroded? Oh, absolutely. But there's a lot of people who I think understand that, and that is a cause for hope.
Can I just, thank you, sir. Can I just encourage others to come to the microphone as well while I follow up with Tasha by saying the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada has come out publicly and said, my dad's married to another man. Is that an indication to you that this Conservative Party of Canada may be different from some of its predecessors?
I definitely think so. I think that the Conservative Party currently, on many what we would consider, social issues like gay marriage or LGBTQ marriage, has definitely changed and evolved over time. I think that the perception, there still is a perception that there is a social conservative element within the party that may not be completely on board with all the types of rights that are being discussed in the political sphere. I think that though every party has conversations within it, right? I think that the issue to me is that how does the party reconcile also voter bases and thinking of women's rights and other things that have been entrenched in law, such as the right to abortion. Bringing forward a law on abortion is something the Conservative Party said they will not do, and yet people still think in their minds, there's still this perception out there that maybe they would, I think that the Conservative Party has made it pretty clear, Mr. Poilievre has made it pretty clear on that issue, but I think one of the ways to make it clear is to say, look, it's settled by law. It is settled by law, right? It's been settled by courts, so leave it there. It is a challenge, though, I think that they will face on those issues consistently because it's an effective tool for the Liberals or the other parties to raise that issue and obscure some of the more important issues, like we said, economic issues and others that people really want to talk about.
Yes, please. Next up, the mic.
Hi. First off, I would like to thank all of you for coming today. I liked the term American by birth, Canadian by choice. I am one of those. And so this is actually a really unique opportunity for me, especially as someone who has been politically involved on both sides of the border. My question is actually kind of to both Michigan State Senator Stephanie Chang, as well as you, Member of Parliament Michelle Rempel Garner. The U.S. ambassador was very clear that, a lot of the tone is set from the leadership top down. However, it is very clear in all parties across both countries that we have leadership that wants to, continue the divisive rhetoric we've seen and continue the toxicity we've seen in politics. So my question is, how can we, inside, politically involved, kind of hold that leadership to account within our own parties? It's a very unique situation because while, yes, it starts from the top down, what we have leadership in our parties, that is not helping things. And so how do we from the inside try to improve it?
Senator Chang, go ahead.
That's a really good question. And I'm not sure that there's one right answer, but I do think that something that a previous speaker said really kind of resonated with me. On both sides of the aisle, well, in obviously America, two parties. So anyway, on both sides of the aisle in America, I think we need to do a better job of uplifting folks on the other side when they do something positive, to call something out or to reject some type of extremist notion. Or, I'm just thinking of a few of my colleagues that I serve with in the Michigan State Senate, Republican colleagues who have gone out of their way to support, LGBTQ rights, or gone out of their way to, denounce an attack or different things like that. And so I actually think that we have to recognize that it actually takes quite a bit of courage for people to say something like that when they know that they're very likely going to get attacked for it. And so I have definitely tried my best to make sure that I know that it's appreciated and to ask what I can do to help and support. But as far as, for folks with, folks who are politically engaged, no matter what party you're in, it definitely is important for you to reach out to let folks know when they're either doing something right or wrong, and to make sure that we're celebrating wins, even the small wins. I'm not talking about policy wins. I'm talking about the wins when we're being good humans, that we've got to make sure to uplift that.
Michelle Garner.
Briefly, I want to echo that. Like right before the panel started, a member of the audience said, "I'm not on your political team, but thank you for your vote on gay rights." And I was like, yes. All right, that means a lot. It's, so it is like rewarding somebody you might not agree with or all the time for saying like, okay, thank you for something. It's not about us though. We do have to show leadership. The other thing I'd say is part of being politically active and showing that leadership is understanding that being polite and civil doesn't mean shying away from having a big, meaty, robust debate on policy, right? It's demonstrating that you can oppose a political, a policy position or look at things a different way without resorting to basket of deplorables or other sort of language that puts everybody into, it's an ad hominem attack, right? And I think if we can get back to that, if we can try and get to that point, that's the way, and that's what, internally in a political party is valued. I think that makes a big difference too.
Let me do a quick follow-up with the ambassador on this, and I want to take you back 30 years to what they called the Sister Souljah moment, which is when Bill Clinton, when he was running for president, took on a member of his own base, basically Sister Souljah, this well-known person in the cultural communities of the United States, and shut her down for making some comments that he thought were completely outrageous. It was considered very risky because he was going against the base of his own party. Is anything like that even remotely possible in America today, where people take on their own base when something bad is said? Both sides.
So I actually think that's still more possible in the Democratic side than the Republican side. And I only say the Republican side because right now it's all falling in line with Donald Trump and what he says, and going against what Donald Trump says is you're paying a price politically. And if you're paying a price politically, it's just too hard to start pointing things out and doing what you described. And I don't see him doing it other than being just off the rails in the way he attacks certain members, even of his own party, but they're more being attacked because they're not following him than anything you described with regard to Bill Clinton. I do think the Democratic Party has that ability going forward, and it'll be very interesting to see. We had just this last 2 weeks a letter that was presented by the far left of the Democratic Party about Ukraine. That letter was pulled back. That letter was pulled back. It didn't just magically get pulled back. Somebody made phone calls, somebody put pressure and said, this does not reflect the party. This is not appropriate, and it was pulled back. And I think those things are still possible again in the Democratic Party. I hope we can get to the point. I have voted Republican and Democrat in my life. I believe, and I am more of a centrist in many of my views, while I'm more progressive in social views and more economically conservative, but I cannot see myself supporting a party that doesn't do the kinds of things that you just talked about, either calling out insurrections or calling out anti-Semitism or calling out hate speech or doing the things that they're doing that are dividing America today.
Gotcha. Yes, sir, you're next.
I'd like to bring the conversation down to a local level and address my question to the mayor, if I might.
Yeah, sure.
Mayor Dilkins, first of all, congratulations on your reelection. I think we were all kind of expecting it, but we weren't really expecting your opponent to do quite so well with nearly 40% of the vote. So my question is, going forward in the next 4 years, how would you address the concerns of the people who didn't vote for you, and are there any policies that we might see coming out of City Hall that would appeal to the people who didn't support you?
Mayor Dilkins, just to make sure we can see you, why don't you come up here, stand here, and face the cameras so that we can see you. Okay, you heard the question.
Yeah, I appreciate the question, and we are less than a week off the results of the election. And on election night, I was asked a very similar question. It was, what elements of your opponent's platform will you be adopting? And my response then and my response now is that I ran a campaign laying out my platform. And there were some overlaps. And I think if you look at the record of what was delivered over the last 4 years, it proves that there were some overlaps. So I've ran a campaign. I've told the public what I'm prepared to do if they elect me, and I received the majority of the votes. And so I intend on moving forward with that platform and delivering the results that I promised to do.
Can I just, while you're here, can I ask you a follow-up? Because I didn't do it at the top of the program, and I probably should have. The guy who threatened to assassinate you on Election Day, what happened to him?
He was arrested, he was interviewed, he's been charged, and he's been released.
He's out on bail now.
He's out with conditions. And so, you know, it's one of those, you were talking about a disquieting type of event. It's one of those things that has happened with more frequency. It just happened to occur this week again. But it's the type of thing that, you know, we are here, everyone on this panel who has served in public office, everyone who is in this audience, who has held elected office, who does something for their community, is here to do a good thing. I don't believe any people, whether you're Democrat or Republican, whether you are a Liberal, NDP, or Conservative, I don't believe anyone here is here to do a bad thing. They're here for the right reasons. And so it's about a dialogue, it's about listening, it's about trying to find that common ground. And I think that's what I'm hearing from this panel, and I think that's what we need to see more of moving forward.
Gotcha. Thank you. Okay. Yes, sir, at the microphone with a question.
Hi, so we've all talked about the importance of social media, and I'm sure you all understand that. So how do you think Bill C-11 would impact online political discussion?
Bill C-11, making an impact on political discussion. Anybody want in on that? Who wants in on that?
Just for my colleagues too,
Okay.
so you can know what C-11 is. Sort of overview, it's a bill proposed by the federal Liberals to address some of the issues on social media around discourse. But a lot of the pushback on this has been, and sorry, it's also to deal with, I think, I'm better with bill titles than numbers, but some of the ways that companies are compensated as well too, I think falls into that. I am very hesitant to have the government insert itself into regulating what can and can't be said and shown online. The government, I think it was about a year and a half ago, the then Heritage Minister made a comment about and was musing about like media requiring licenses in Canada from the government to operate. And that's kind of scary. I don't want that. And it was interesting how that issue sort of crossed the political spectrum and people said like, look, we have to protect free speech. And I think again, I am very suspect, not of the need to have some sort of framework in which, speech takes place online, but it can't be limiting on ideological perspective. Otherwise, we're actually perpetuating the problem. We have laws that address uttering threats, criminal harassment, hate speech. I think we need to give law enforcement more tools to use those. I remember this is nearly 10 years ago now. I think I was the first case of somebody committing criminal harassment using Twitter. That was not a fun experience for me. But even myself in a privileged position, it was a very difficult process to go through. And I can't imagine what it would have been like for somebody who, I was a sitting federal cabinet minister at the time, right? Who didn't have my privilege and my position. So I think that's the lower hanging fruit. I am very worried that government putting controls over what ideology potentially, what types of accounts could go forward actually perpetuates a narrative that the government can't be trusted, that there's people controlling, there's these grand conspiracies. And I think we should be very careful about anything in that regard.
Very good.
Steve, if I may.
Sure.
I just want to highlight one thing. I don't have an opinion on C11, or I think the other one is C18.
Yes.
I haven't gotten deeply into them. I know there are complex issues, but I want to highlight one thing, which is sometimes you can use social media for good, for the kinds of things that Tasha talks about. One of my favorite people in politics these days is Alberta Senator Paula Simons. She is Paula-tics on Twitter, and she's really taken up the issue of C11 and C18 and put up a number of very thoughtful written pieces and a number of videos of her speeches and so on to try and educate people. She's not really taking an opinion one way or the other, but she's trying to cut through a lot of the rhetoric that we've heard about this to talk about the real issues at stake. And to me, that's a great example of what Twitter used to be like back in those halcyon days 5 or 6 whole years ago.
It's like 15 now.
I think it's like 10. We're getting
Yeah,
older, right?
we're old.
But just to highlight that you can still do it. And so if you want to learn more about this topic from a relatively nonpartisan view, give Senator Paula Simons a follow.
Great. Yes, sir, you're next.
Hi. This is a good opportunity to get to actually see that politicians are people. I'm a citizen. I'm not currently involved in politics. I'm not a student. I'm just a citizen. And one of the things
You are a citizen, not just a citizen.
one of the things I find problematic is that, so as a citizen, I generally have that middle view that you guys have all expressed that you have. And then there's the politics of it. So there's two parties. I argue right now with the deal with the NDP, there's only two parties here. There's two parties in the States. So if I have to make a decision, I have to make a one party decision or the other party decision. So all I'm hearing, I believe that electric cars are the future, but I also believe currently we need fuel. So you guys mentioned at the beginning of this Alberta and its situation, and as I said, as I see it, our cars and our homes currently run on natural gas and gasoline. So the idea of not allowing Alberta to export that resource doesn't make a lot of sense to me. In the same side of that coin, I also believe that they should be building nuclear power for the electricity that we're going to need in the future. How do I vote? So this becomes the heart of that Facebook problem, is that in the end of the day, I have to pick one party or the other. No matter how crazy the debate gets, you watch Question Period, I can't. It's crazy.
So there's that.
So how do I go as a voter? I got to vote. So
Let's get you some advice up here, shall we?
Please.
Okay, Tasha, you weigh in first.
Okay, I was going to say, the American system is more polarized, I think, partly because they have two clear parties, and there are independent voters, but that means they will not vote for other candidates. They vacillate. We have a multiplicity of parties at the federal level. It's true, though, that only two really are in a position to form government traditionally. But I think for citizens, it is difficult because there are a lot of people like yourself who either see the good in one and the good in the other, don't feel that they're represented, feel that there is maybe a missing middle something more common sense that's not there. So I think it's incumbent on political parties to be very clear about what they stand for on different things. And you'll see at elections, media always go through and say, well, here's the topics and here's what they all say. But that is a responsibility of politicians, and you need to hold them into account to be clear about what they stand for, because you're never going to find the perfect mix of everything. But you have to decide what issues are the most important for you, too. What issues are the most important and what party represents that, and what change you really think is necessary. Who embodies that the most? There may be things you don't like about other policies they have, but it is a bit of a Hobson's choice. But at the end of the day, that's, I think, the only way that we can, make a choice.
Just for the people watching in the States, I want to get your take on this, Ambassador, because right now, Democrats and Republicans, and those are pretty much the obvious options you have in the States. There is another group that has come forward trying to create a centrist coalition. They may run a candidate in the next presidential election with a Democrat at the top of the ticket and a Republican at the bottom, or vice versa. What do you think the chances of that taking off are?
Small, really small.
Would it be advisable, though, for it to happen?
Sure, I think we've got to try. And it's an outlet for dialogue for those people who don't feel they're included. I think the way our system works in Congress and the way one party controls, all the leadership of the various seats and in the Senate and in the House, that a minority party like that would never be able to get control, at least for the foreseeable future. And so as a result of that, you got to really work with the candidates to try to select the candidates that more accurately reflect the views of the middle.
Can I put more skin on the bone here?
Sure.
What if Liz Cheney's at the top of the ticket and somebody else who's a Democrat, moderate Democrat, is at the bottom of the ticket? Given the work that she's done to try to bring some sanity back to your country, do you think that has a shot?
No. It doesn't have a shot, no. Because what's going to end up happening, if you look at our country very closely, you have some number of states that are going to go Republican, regardless of who you put there. Some number of states are going to go Democrat, regardless of who you put there. And there's about a half a dozen to less than 10 states that actually are going to decide the presidency. And even if that person won those 10 states, they would not win control of the House, the Senate, or the presidency. And so as a result of that, look, my only hope sitting here, put partisan hat back on now, is if Donald Trump is the nominee of the Republican Party, that Liz Cheney definitely runs in that third party and siphons off some number of who he calls rhinos, which I'll call saviors, to move out of the Republican Party and tip it back to the Democrats.
Okay. Rhinos, Republicans in name only. Yeah. Yes, ma'am, you have the next question.
My question is that why do we even need politicians? Because I read this platform and I read this from the municipal to the federal, and this one sounds great, and I vote for that, and they do nothing about what they said. Nobody talks about the issue that I am an average person facing. I have a professional job. My child who makes 3 times as much as I made when I bought my house cannot buy a house anywhere, cannot even rent. I make good money that I made 20 years ago when I was raising my kids, but still I cannot keep up with my bills. The only thing that makes me more upset of politicians from the municipal to the top of changing their opinion of what they told me in the platform is the amount of money that election cost and what that money could have done. Like 2019, we went on this snap election, spent millions of dollars for what? And I lived in this city for 28 years. I only vote because I grew up in a place where I wasn't allowed to vote. I just vote for that principle. I'm standing in the booth and thinking, am I voting for this mayor or this mayor? Am I voting for this, trustee or that trustee?
But your big problem is they don't keep the promises they make.
They don't keep the promise they make, and they don't think about the average person like me that's struggling.
Well, okay. You're elected to Parliament. Do you want to tell us on that?
I think what was just expressed is such a beautiful and strong illustration of the root of the frustration that a lot of our division is based upon. It's, what are you doing for me? How are you going to help
my life get better? You know, and for me, there was this UK politician, if you have a chance to watch, he was a Tory. If you guys are following what happened in the UK, you know, and he went out and he just said, this is a disgrace. This is disgrace on my party. What are normal people thinking? And you get, you know, there's this propensity when you're in the heat of the moment, you're in Ottawa or in Washington or, you know, your state legislator or whatever, and where you're dealing with politics and it's like, it's not about you. At the end of the day, it's not about me. It is about somebody not being able to, their children not being able to afford a house or fill up a tank of gas or find a job. Like that's where the rubber hits the road. And going back to what I said earlier, I really think it's like, I see you. Yes, that is a problem. And that is what we have to address. And the more that politicians, we're vote maximizing machines, we will do what the public tells us to do at the end of the day. If the public is saying they want to be seen on those issues, we have a duty to make sure that we're not using division to just skate over these issues, as has been mentioned, and to actually resolve this. So, but I think this is coming to a head. I think what you just said, what was just said here, is the theme. We just saw it in municipal elections across the country. I think it's going to happen more and more. I think it'll be an issue in the midterms in the US. And I think that is going to tip the scales probably in a better way, I hope.
Senator Chang, can I get you on this? You're the only other person who's up here who's elected currently. Do you and your colleagues have problems keeping the promises that you make? And is that part of what's ailing democracy today?
So I think that there's a couple things to say. You know, one, this is going to sound like very basic, but I think, you know, as elected officials, I try to think of myself not as a politician, but as a public servant. And a lot of it is just like basic calling people back or showing up, like literally showing up for people and providing really good constituent services. I think that is like the primary reason why I've been reelected so many times. And just literally being in the community, I think makes a really big difference. And so that's one thing. I know that sounds very basic, but you actually can't take that for granted. And I think that some of my colleagues are unfortunately, you know, better. You know, there's varying levels of how engaged people are. So that's one thing is I think that people want, if we're going to repair, you know, the cynicism or the feeling that somehow government isn't working for people, we've got to like literally be there and show up. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is, you know, I think it is super important that public servants follow through on the promises that we make. I have the luxury, and to some degree, of being in a very Democratic district, and I'm a pretty progressive Democrat, and so I'm able to work on the issues that I said that I was going to, and have done pretty much everything that I said that I was going to do in terms of advocating for certain issues. Although I've served in the minority, so I haven't accomplished all of it, but I definitely have been able to achieve quite a bit, even serving in the minority. And so I think that one of the issues that we face, and this may not, one of the issues that we face is that we, we've got term limits in Michigan, and so we have folks who come in and are learning the job as quickly as they can, and then they're gone a few years later. And so we do struggle, I think, and we've got a proposal on the ballot that might help address this, but we sometimes do struggle with just having folks who even know how to get things done, because it's one thing to be a candidate and have ideas about what to do, but then being able to build a coalition, work across the aisle, find stakeholders to get involved and help push an issue. That's a lot of work, and not everyone comes into this job knowing how to do it, unfortunately. And so that may be a little bit too granular or inside baseball, but I think that a lot of people have a lot of good ideas, right? But not everyone comes in knowing how to do the job. And so as a person who votes, being able to not look at someone's platform, but also try to examine what is this person's background, learn more about the person's actual ability to get things done, I think is super important. I think that one of the things that our governor, Gretchen Whitmer, has been doing really well is actually using this phrase, getting things done, and talking about just delivering results for people. as Democrats, sometimes we do not do a very good job of always communicating the things that we're doing for people, because sometimes we're actually working on a lot of stuff that affects a lot of people, but if we haven't directly communicated it, then it just sort of gets lost in the clutter.
We have term limits in Canada.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they're called elections.
Okay, well.
Yeah. Last question.
Last question. Thank you so much for coming today. You've spoken often of from the top down. I'm incredibly concerned about the bottom up. Your comments on literacy really kind of blew my mind in Canada. Our children are being raised differently today for a lot of different reasons. And here's that cell phone. Golly, you're in grade 5 and you don't have a cell phone. What you do in grade 5 is you spend about this much time of your curriculum learning about democracy in Canada. In grade 5, I was there as a guest speaker to say the federal, the provincial, the municipal, and that was it. Back when I was a child in grade 5, we had elections. We involved our children, we got them excited about what democracy is. What can we as a government, all of us, all of you, the leaders at the top, how can we bring back real education to our children to make them proud of where they live?
Okay, Naheed Nenshi, you mentioned the illiteracy. What can we do?
Actually, it was Tasha.
Oh, Tasha, forgive me, yeah.
Who did that, but maybe I'll jump in,
Go
Tasha,
ahead,
and let you correct all my mistakes after that. This is really important, what you're highlighting. And in Alberta, interestingly, we have a situation right now where there was a proposed new curriculum from the previous government, which was extraordinarily controversial because the previous government had tried to bring in a curriculum, frankly, of civic literacy, the kind of things you're talking about. When they lost government, the next government accused that of being a political, ideologically driven curriculum. It was about wokeness. We need to get rid of it. We need to go back to the basics. And they brought in, frankly, a ridiculous, horrific curriculum that had incredible protest across the province. But here's the fascinating thing. We've just had it felt like a 900-month-long Conservative leadership race. And the issue of that curriculum came up 0 times, except one debate for the teachers. So we have no idea what the Premier wants to do. The reason I highlight this is because to me, and I'm sorry if I sound like a conspiracy theorist, to me, the proposed curriculum was designed specifically to do the opposite of what you're saying. It was actually much more ideological than the previous one, and it was designed to dumb down people's civic literacy. And look, I'll just be blunt with you. In Ontario, you saw a movement to try and take over the school boards in this last election, which failed, by and large, to do that kind of work. And there is a lot of folks, and our American friends may nod or shake their heads on this, who've talked about what happened in Texas. Texas used to be a purple state. Democrat Governor Ann Richards. And the Republican Party in that state started by taking over the school boards to the point where there are special textbooks only for Texas. And now it is a reliably red state. So I really believe that that was happening. And so I really want to highlight what you said, but also the last 2 speakers. And I think the important thing here is to remember that we as citizens are not consumers of politics. We don't have to vote for what's on offer. We have the ability of affecting what's on offer. So here in Ontario, you know, if you ask people what their top 10 issues are, it would be housing, 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 and housing, right? And yet we have only empty slogans, strong mayor system, remove the red tape, build more houses, instead of really addressing these issues. And we as citizens need to be able to say as beautifully as the last questioner said, my kid makes 3 times as much as me and can't even afford rent. This is not a system that's working. But we also have to create the ability for politicians to be able to speak in nuance. I always say that I speak politics in full sentences. Most people say that's fine. Why are there so many of them? But we have to be able to do that. So, you know, I was listening to Michelle say she would do a happy dance if the Prime Minister said he believed in energy security. I have heard him use exactly those words. Heck, I've written them for him. He bought a pipeline. He is spending billions of dollars in carbon capture sequestration. I heard him say any country that doesn't exploit the resources they have is ridiculous.
Yet there's Bill C-69 and C-48, so actions
But this is the
don't
point.
need-
This is the point, right? We fight about this, and we should. And I have lots of arguments with conservative energy policy because I don't think it takes climate into effect. I think it's way behind where industry is. I have a lot of issues with liberal policy because I think it does not take into account the source of wealth we need in order to make any kind of transition. But it's also a mistake to say, you know, Bill C-69 is the No More Pipelines Act. It's a terrible act for many, many reasons. I fought hard against it. But that's not really what it's about.
It's also
And
a
we as
mistake to
voters.
say the Ontario government isn't doing anything on housing.
Right. Fair
Just
enough.
saying.
Fair enough.
Can I jump in?
But I think
Not
we
to
have
correct
to be able to allow that space for nuance. That's all. Sorry, Tasha.
No, that's okay. I think you raised a number of issues that I will comment because I think that they relate to your question about the role of education, young people, and how they understand the importance of democracy, the value of the democracy that, like I said, we take for granted. What happened with school boards was partly a backlash in Ontario to a sense that school was not focusing on issues that actually would advance what you're talking about. The basic literacy pieces, a lot of stuff that's taught in schools, a lot of things being taught in schools just generally that as a parent, I look at Ontario and I say, you know, where are the basic elements that we should be teaching our children? Reading, writing, very basic stuff that is not getting the focus because there's so much stuff being added. And schools are taking on a burden of social responsibility. Some parents will disagree the direction it goes in. It has gone very far. There have been examples in this province of some very odd things, I'll leave it there, that have really upset a lot of people. And put that focus. So you get this pendulum swing. I agree. You don't want to have a pendulum swing too far the other way, but there has to be some balance, which comes back to the whole point of the responsibility to have a dialogue between extremes and say, okay, what makes sense? Where do we want to go from here? And we want to go to a society that is civically literate, that is literally literate, that can read and write to understand, is not just consuming video, right? Our kids consume a lot of video. That's not teaching them to read. It's something that we don't think about. We put technology into their hands very early because we think everyone should. Well, is it really helping them value the things that you talked about? No. So we do have to teach more about those values of democracy and its importance. And I think also as a society realize that it's under threat in many ways around the world. And that maybe is something, you know, to close as a way of unifying us to say, look, as a country, we have to defend our human rights and our charter and all the things that we value against any threat from anywhere, external, internal. That's something that's the glue that binds, and teach those charter values. I agree. Civics is right now a very short course in grade 5. It needs to be more.
That feels like a great place to leave this. I want to do 3 things before we leave. Number 1, Art Windsor Essex. This is a gorgeous facility. We thank you so much for allowing us to be here. I want to thank His Honor Drew Dilkins and the City of Windsor, who have made us feel just very much at home here in southwestern Ontario. So thank you to you and to the people of Windsor who have been so great. And finally, I know all of you want to join me in thanking these 5 people for coming from very near and very far to join us here on TVO tonight. Thank you all so much.
TVO Today Live is made possible by the generous support of the Wilson Foundation.